Hey gang, welcome back to Volty's Classroom. Today is going to be another video essay, and we're going to be talking about Force of Will as a card. I've labeled it Force of Will as bad game design, which I do believe to be the case, but we'll go into that as we explore the nuance of the arguments both for and against. Recently there has been a bit of buzz about Force of Will. It joined the watch list for 7-Point Highlander, and obviously throughout its history it's been a mainstay of competitive Magic discourse. Pretty much for as long as Legacy and Vintage have been really popular formats for Magic, Force of Will has been mentioned or brought up or talked about. So for those of you who aren't aware, this is the card Force of Will. For 3 blue, you get an instant that says counter target spell, and as an alternative cost, you may pay 1 life and exile a blue card from your hand instead of paying its mana cost. So the characteristics that Force has, it has a prohibitive casting cost, it has a free alternate intended cost, it is unconditional in that it can hit anything, it is unrestricted in that it can be used at any point in time, and it's interactable, so it functions like any other spell. There are plenty of counter spells that can't be countered or end the counter war, for example, but these are the basic characteristics that Force of Will has as a Magic card. So throughout Magic's history, we have seen plenty of counter spells being printed over time. The actual card counterspell, which tells you what it does, was originally printed in Alpha, so that was 92. Force of Will was introduced in Alliances, which was 96. And Cancel was introduced in Time Spiral in 2006. Now, Cancel isn't the only counterspell that's been printed in between Alpha and now, but it is very important to state that the direct upgrade from Counterspell to Cancel was 14 years in the making. So Cancel is what occurred when WotC tried to fix Counterspell. They acknowledged that Counterspell was too powerful of a Magic card at 2 mana, and they thought, what if we just make it 3 instead? From there, we have seen plenty of counterspells that have been printed that are at 3 mana. There are some that are at 2 mana that are conditional. There are also some that are just completely backbreaking at 2 mana, like Mana Drain, but I believe that's the main example that you'd be able to see. But what happens when, instead of trying to fix Counterspell, which costs mana and trades with a card, what happens when you try and fix that Force of Will problem, where you have a free Counterspell, but it's too powerful? This is not a complete set of every free counterspell that has been printed in Magic the Gathering's history, but these are all worth highlighting here. So Daze was printed in Nemesis, that was 2000. Foil was printed in Prophecy, that was also 2000. Disrupting Shoal was Betrayers of Kamigawa, so 2005. Pact of Negation was Future Sight, so 2007. Mental Misstep 2011. In New Phyrexia, Force of Negation in MH1 2019. Subtlety in MH2 in 2021. And Flare of Denial in MH3 in 2024. Not listed on this page is Fierce Guardianship from Commander 2020, but it's worth noting that one as well. So some of these cards on that previous slide have seen a lot of play, or they continue to see a lot of play, but for the most part, the range is incredibly bad to the best card in the format. So in the case of Mental Misstep, it is by far the most powerful thing you can do if you're looking to interact on the stack in any format that is full of 1-drops. And if you're looking to play Foil, you're probably playing in a very weak and low-powered format, where it's possible you might be better off playing a Cancel variant. The critical point here, though, is that all of these cards are better designed cards when compared to Force of Will. There are key decisions that happen, and when you're using or thinking about these cards or building your decks with these cards, there are a lot of niche applications, a lot of nuanced decision making, and when you're actually playing the cards, you're meant to be engaging in the game on an interesting axis that Force of Will does not allow you to do. So for example, if you want to play around days, you can play cheaper threats when you have more mana. You can play off curve. You can also play the most expensive card in your hand and make the days player decide how much they can afford their mana getting disrupted. And this is one of the premier points of Days counterplay is, well, at the very least, if my spell gets countered, my opponent will have less mana for their follow-up spells. Pact of Negation is normally used to protect a spell, so if you're able to interact with the spell that's on the stack in multiple ways, or if you're presenting multiple effects that the person playing Pact of Negation needs to counter, that then leads to natural counterplay. In the case of Misstep, you can sequence your spells in a slightly different order. I would say that Mental Misstep has the least counterplay out of all of the non-Force of Will options, but it is worth noting that in its time in Standard, as well as some of the formats it existed in before it got banned, there actually was a little bit you could do to beat Misstep. Force of Negation has a very restrictive casting window, so playing around with that mechanic is crucial to beating the card. Subtlety, the impact can be reduced by sequencing your creatures in a different order, or by pressuring your opponent's resources, so that if they have to play a subtlety, you can put the thing that you want back on top and they're down 2 cards. And Flare of Denial, obviously you can kill all of their blue creatures. Basically, the cost of using these spells, it varies a lot. A lot of these spells are just more powerful than others, but it's possible to reduce the impact they have on the game, and it's possible to increase the cost to the player who is playing those cards. So if your opponent doesn't want to lose a blue card to use Force of Negation and wants to spend 3 mana on it instead to keep that blue card in their hand, you can make them counter something that costs less than 3 mana, and you'll be able to generate a mana advantage. It's also very possible that you can put them in a squeeze where they might not be able to use Force of Negation incredibly effectively based off the timing of your spells. The more powerful versions of free counter magic that have risen to the top of the pile will usually have less counterplay options, or they're very generically powerful or generically useful. But when you compare all of the cards that aren't Force of Will with Force of Will, the difference is really stark. Even though Mental Misstep is hard to play around, even though you sometimes have to play into Force of Negation, Force of Will always do the thing that it's meant to do, and it will always do that at the best rate. So while there are bad matchups for Force of Will, for the most part, that happens in games where casting the Force of Will or any other counterspells would be unproductive. So it's very extreme circumstances where Force of Will is bad and that another counterspell that is free would be good. If Force of Will is bad, for the most part, counterspells are probably bad. And this happens a lot in, Death and Taxes versus Delver, for example, or any kind of duress-based combo deck that is looking to put pressure on. Force of Will is never bad in comparison to another free counterspell. It is always bad in a vacuum. And I think that's a really important distinction. All of the other free counterspells that exist in Magic have bad matchups. Force of Negation is very, very bad against creature decks. Mental Misstep is very bad if your opponent is casting 2-drops and 3-drops. Subtlety is bad if they're playing all spells. Daze is bad if all of their spells are really cheap. The list goes on. Moving on to other games, I want to highlight some things, and this is going to be pretty critical in looking at the game design aspect of Force of Will. Now, looking at the card through the lens of Magic the Gathering is obviously the easiest way for us to understand the impact of its design. However, there are lessons to be learned from other card games. So on screen here are 2 Yu-Gi-Oh cards. Yu-Gi-Oh does not have a resource system in the traditional sense that Magic does. There is no mana system. There is no incremental advantage to be gained by playing more mana. And for the most part, you're restricted in the actions you can take, which are specifically limited during turns. So for example, normal summoning can occur once per turn, which means the resource that you have is one normal summon per turn. There are plenty of actions that are not limited, but will usually have some kind of effect on the card that limits their impact, but it's very critical to know that there isn't a mana-based resource system. Historically, Yu-Gi-Oh! Was a game where the play-draw disparity was really, really big. You would typically set up a turn 1 that was uninteractable. Before your opponent could do anything, they couldn't set up their trap cards, and they would simply just get run over. It's possible they could interact on their own turn and destroy some of your creatures, but for the most part, if you were setting up a board that would lock them out, the game would end. As such, Konami has printed several cards over the last 5 to 10 years that are known as hand traps, and basically they're effects that occur much like free counter magic, where you use them from your hand at instant speed to disrupt your opponent. So in the case of Ash Blossom, you can tag something that works as a tutor, and in the case of Maxi, you can draw extra cards for each time your opponent special summons to stop them from special summoning. But what's very important about all of the hand traps, and there are a lot, there's at least 30 at this point that have been printed, all of them are designed to disrupt your opponent, and all of them are conditional. And I think this is the really critical component about how Yu-Gi-Oh! Has stuck around. You can't use hand traps or this free counter magic, for the most part, to protect your own turn. You are using it to disrupt your opponent to offset the play draw disparity at the cost of a resource. And additionally, all of them are conditional. If your opponent is playing a certain archetype and you have the wrong hand trap, you are just down a card, and that's meant to promote interesting deck building decisions where you're trying to work out which hand traps you play, in what quantity, and how you sequence your turns out. Next up we have Hearthstone. Hearthstone does have a mana-based resource system, however how you generate that mana is different. But what's critical is that Hearthstone does not have instant speed interaction in the game. So your turns, for the most part, will be completely uninterrupted. In Yu-Gi-Oh! And in several other card games, the ability to interact at instant speed is very prevalent. Hearthstone does not have that because of the way the game is designed. It's meant to promote being able to turn your brain off during your opponent's turn. There is exactly one exception to this in Hearthstone's history, which are secret cards. Basically, secret cards are conditional effects that disrupt your opponent that have several key categories to prevent them from becoming overpowered. Firstly, you have to pay for them in advance. In order to use Objection on your opponent's turn to counter their minion, you have to spend 3 mana to put the objection into play. And if your opponent doesn't proc it and doesn't play a minion, your objection will just sit there. So you have to spend that 3 mana, and it might not work. Part 2 is that all secrets are conditional. They all have some kind of proccing effect, or some kind of trigger, and they all do something. In the case of counterspell and objection, for example, if you have a counterspell in play and your opponent plays a minion, counterspell will do nothing. If you have an objection in play and your opponent plays a spell, your objection will do nothing. Every single secret is conditional and requires a trigger to proc. Part 3 is that every secret can be played around because it's possible to deduce what secrets are available in the format and therefore what is likely that your opponent has in play. If you have not procced their secret and you have done everything that would proc every other secret that's legal in the format, then you know what that secret is. Once you do, you can then play around it. It's not quite the same as a guessing game where you think that your opponent might have a counterspell and you simply don't get to find out whether they do or not until they decide to pull the trigger on that counterspell. Lastly, and this is another very critical thing or component about the secret design in Hearthstone, you cannot control how your secrets work. Now what I mean by this is that if I play Objection and it says when your opponent plays a minion, counter it, I don't get to choose if I want to counter the minion that they have played. The secret will choose for me. So if my opponent plays a 1-drop and I don't want to counter it, and then they play a 7-drop and I do want to counter it, the objection will counter the 1-drop, the 7-drop will resolve, and I will die. And that is an incredibly important part of the game design aspect, and I think it's a thing that Hearthstone has done incredibly well in order to keep the game as healthy as it has been. You know, having the ability to interact at instant speed is a luxury, and it really gets decided as you build your game. But in the case of Hearthstone, they decided against that, but they also wanted to have some level of flexibility around what your opponent can do and being able to interrupt what your opponent does. This is what they came up with, and I think they're really, really good. Lastly, on our list of card games that are not Magic that I'll talk about here is Legends of Runeterra. Legends of Runeterra has a forced resource system like Hearthstone, where you generate mana every turn, but because you are able to interact at instant speed, and you are able to interact in a variety of different ways, how you spend your mana has been taken into consideration during the game design. So if you look on the left here, we have Deny, which is probably the closest thing to a hard counter spell in the game. It doesn't counter creatures, and it costs 4 mana. And I think that's really, really important, is because they don't have a mana system, and they know that everyone is going to be able to cast the vast majority of their spells over the course of a game, they have to account for that in their card design. One thing I do want to highlight about Runeterra is that every bit of stack interaction and every bit of instant speed interaction they've ever made has been conditional. You must fulfill some kind of condition to use the vast majority of instants that you would call them in the game. And I think that's really important, and I really wish that this game was still alive, because I think they were actually doing a really good job about it. But very clearly, because of how they designed interactive spells in Runeterra, there is always just a bunch of matchups where your cards are dead, and you don't want to be drawing them, and that makes for, again, meaningful deck decisions. So, what happens when you don't have traditional interaction? There are plenty of other games that have their own restrictions or requirements when designing interaction, and that's usually dependent on their resource system, typical play pattern, skill ceiling, for example. I want it clearly stated that plenty of card games have little or no traditional interaction, and as long as it's understood when you're actually making cards for the game, it should not make the game worse by default. Magic has the stack, and that is a luxury, which we will get into, but for the most part, building a simpler game that doesn't have that level of interaction has its own merits, and you are able to attract a certain percentage of your audience based off that simplicity. So this gets us to Magic's problem, and I think the core issue that Magic experiences during its game design is related to the stack, which is theoretically its greatest mechanic. Almost everything in the game uses the stack, and that also means that everything else uses the stack as well. What I mean by this is creatures use the stack to be played, which means anything that interacts with creatures on the stack would also be using the stack. Any spells that interact with creatures in play will use the stack, which means any spells that will interact with those spells will also use the stack. So a cancel on a creature, both of those things exist on the stack. A giant growth in response to a lightning bolt, both of those things use the stack. Because of how complex that interaction system is, WotC has to be incredibly careful when they design cards and introduce them to that system. And I think it's very critical, and it's part of Magic's success, but the basic function of the game, which is using the stack and putting things on the stack, theoretically has the highest skill ceiling, because understanding how to use the stack and abuse all of the nuances to it is a great way to level up your game. So anything that disrupts the function of the stack must do so at a rate that is appropriate. So the more it disrupts the function, the more it must cost to do so. The lower the disruption, the lower the cost. What this means is if a counterspell removes something from the stack, that is worth more than something that is simply additive to the stack. So if you bolt my guy and I giant growth, those are allowed to be the same cost because giant growth is additive to the stack. It's not removing something from the stack. And this then leads to a spectrum, and this is where every bit of instant speed interaction exists, as well as every other form of interaction that exists in Magic that uses the stack. So theoretically, on this spectrum, where everything lives in Magic's interaction space, we have the worst possible counterspell that can be designed, and the best possible counterspell that can be designed. So for example, we have 0 mana, counter any number of things. That is the absolute pinnacle of one end of the spectrum. It removes as many things from the stack as you would like for free. And on the other extreme end of the spectrum would be something that costs infinity mana, adds something to the stack, and then removes that thing and affects nothing else on the stack. So theoretically, everything exists on that spectrum. What that means, and this is a critical component for game design and understanding game theory, is that when you have the extreme ends of a spectrum and you understand everything that could theoretically exist on that spectrum, you can then analyze cards that we already know exist on that spectrum and view them through that lens. So because we have cards that exist on the counterspell spectrum, any other cards added to the counterspell suite in Magic have to be more, less, or equally powerful as any other cards we have on that category. Theoretically, every single time we make a card that counters a spell that exists on that category, we know it will be better than some percentage of them, worse than some percentage of them, and about the same power level as the rest of them. And that's just going to be where all of the counterspells that exist on that spectrum live. So for example, if we were to make a card that was single blue, counter target spell, we know that wouldn't be on the extreme end of the spectrum. However, we would know that it's strictly better than counterspell, strictly better than cancel, and different to Force of Will. And we would then have to gauge where it lives on that spectrum and where we want to live that, where we want that card to live on that spectrum. So because Force of Will exists, and we know what the card is and where it is on the spectrum, there is a benchmark that has now been set. We know what it takes to make the best counterspell that actually exists, and we have to make sure that everything we want to add to the counterspell suite is worse than that. If you want to make a spell that is better than Force of Will, that's okay. You just have to be aware that that's what you're doing. And if you're not aware of that, that's when problems arise. And it's very critical that Force of Will is the example for this, because if you look at other counterspells on the spectrum, you may think you're designing a card that is weaker than something that doesn't exist in that format, but it is stronger than other things that exist in that format. And if you're not cognizant, if you're not incredibly aware of where on the spectrum your new card is, you're at risk of endangering a format by introducing something that is strictly better than all of its counterparts. Realistically, viewing this card design spectrum from this lens is fine when you look at formats that don't have Force of Will, because every time you make a card for standard in a standard legal set, you don't have to worry about whether or not a card is better or not than Force of Will, because it doesn't exist in that format and is therefore outside of that section of the spectrum where you're allowed to work in. So what you would usually do is look at counterspells that do exist in that format, look at counterspells that have existed in that format, and work out where you want this new card to be on that spectrum. So realistically, you don't have to adjust new card design for Force of Will. However, you do have to adjust card evaluation because of Force of Will. And this is a very interesting separation, which is a whole other video essay if I wanted to. Unfortunately, what it does mean when we're viewing the metrics of a counterspell, especially a free counterspell, is that if it's in a format that does have Force of Will, we know where that end of the spectrum is. Which means everything is now being compared to something that actually exists on that line. So the only way for Force of Will to not be the best option available is if a more powerful option exists. However, designing a card that is more powerful than Force of Will automatically outclass everything else in the free counterspell and realistically the counterspell categories, because we already know Force of Will is on that end of the spectrum. On the known end of printed cards, it outclasses everything, so if you put something to the left of it, it will now beat everything. What this then means is that we will never see a counterspell that is printed ever again that is better than Force of Will, presuming that WotC decides to abide by that reasonable sense of game design. So what happens then if we know that other counterspells cannot compete with Force of Will? Well, thankfully, there are restrictions and there are rules, both within and outside of the game, that decide whether or not Force of Will is the best card in that category. For one, you can only play 4 forces in a 60-card deck in a format that it's legal in, which means you have to put 56 other cards into your deck. Alternatively, it is not legal in newer formats, so we know that it exists outside of the spectrum, but it also doesn't matter. For our format, for example, it's on the points list, and therefore it is not strictly better than everything else. And you also need a critical mass of blue cards. This is a bit more nuanced, but Pact of Negation, for example, does exist as a free counterspell that sees play, specifically for decks that do not have the capacity to use Force of Will in formats where both cards are legal. These kinds of restrictions and rules are all necessary just so that we see other counterspells get played and get designed. Because if these restrictions aren't there, we would never see a counterspell that isn't Force of Will. It's as simple as that. Now, I want to make it very clear that I don't think Force of Will is a bad card to have in Magic the Gathering. Without it, a bunch of combo decks would just be very, very optimal. Being able to apply a lot of pressure without having to worry about your opponent having free counter magic will typically win you more games of Magic over a long period of time. However, we may have been better off if Force of Will was never designed and never created the way it is. Because if it didn't get made the way it is, we would have had to compensate during the game design periods after it got made. So if we're worried about combo decks being very, very good and not having instant speed interaction to deal with them, for the most part, those combos would become less reliable, more hate pieces would have been printed, better ways to apply pressure and discard their hand, better ways to have information. Any number of things could have happened if Force of Will didn't exist as a card to look at when viewing those older formats. And I think it's a really interesting thought experiment. If Force of Will didn't exist and didn't get printed in 1996, what would Magic look like now? We would probably have a lower individual power level per threat. We would probably have quite a lot of cheap counter magic that's very conditional at 1 or 2 mana. We would probably have very few combo decks that can just kill you with 1 or 2 cards. And it might be a more interesting game. But overall, I don't think it's a bad thing that Force of Will exists. I think it's an interesting thing that we may have been better off if it never existed in the first place. This video and all of my content was proudly brought to you by my March patrons and donors. If you'd like to see your name up here on screen or support me financially, there's a link down in the description below that you can check out. But otherwise, realistically, this video is probably going to pick up a lot of traction and a lot of hate. If you have any ideas about whether or not you think I'm right or anything you want to discuss, leave it in the comments down below. And I'll catch you next time.